Hi, it's Saturday morning, it's about 8:20 in Bath, and every time I come and shoot here, or think about coming to shoot in Bath, which is where I live and work, it's so noisy in this city, even at supposedly quiet times. It's small and it's in a valley, so it's always a bit of a nightmare trying to get a sort of tranquil thing. First of all, I'm going to show you a little walk I took through my village on the way to the bus stop. I've got the post office there, and then we'll take a little stroll around and we'll talk about one of my favourite writers, Angela Carter. I'm no expert on church architecture, but this does remind me of the churches the Hawksmoor built in London, and I've recently reread Hawksmoor by Peter Ackroyd, which I'll talk about in an upcoming video. This is St Swithin's in Bath. This pub here, the Star, I went for a drink here with Neil Stevenson back in 2008, 2009, after I introduced him at an event at the Bath bookshop. I wasn't working in that bookshop at the time. I was a freelance writer at that point. Yeah, Neil had just published Anthem at that point, huge book, and it was a really enjoyable evening, I must say. What a nice guy he was. We talked about all sorts of things, including Civil War reenactments near where he lived, that sort of stuff. So yeah, it was a good night, that. This is the Paragon in Bath, and Angela Carter lived very close to here in a road just off it. As you see, magnificent example of Georgian architecture, which we're spoilt by here, and which has no effect on me whatsoever. So I've lived here so long, but people like to see this sort of thing. I'm going to do a shout out here to Matt at Science Fiction Reads over in Canada, who loves history. Hope you enjoyed this, Matt. So this is Hay Hill in Bath. I have shown this before in one of my folk horror videos where I talk about the terror sites of Bath, so apologies if you've seen that one, but because I want to talk about Angela Carter today, this is the exact place to do it. So in the mid to late 70s, Angela Carter lived here at number 5 Hay Hill, which is the green door behind me, which is closest to the front of the frame. And while she was here, she wrote this book, The Passion of New Eve. This is the Gollancz first edition. She also wrote what would become The Bloody Chamber, which featured the Company of Ours, which was made into a film, and various other things as well she was working on. So in this shot, it's the furthest of the two doors, and it's the tall, narrow house. And Angela moved into there, and she goes right the way up several floors. And opposite her, in one of these houses, I'm not sure which one, there was some building work going on. One of the builders was a young man called Mark, who was a bit younger than her, I think by about 10 years, and they got it on together and had a child. I was a huge fan of Angela Carter, and I never got to meet her. She actually came in one of the bookshops I worked in on my day off, just as a customer, and I was gutted. She was my favourite living contemporary female author, and she was absolutely brilliant and very interesting. So I'm going to talk about her a bit today, with reference to Bath, with reference to science fiction, what have you, but I thought we'd have a bit of a walk around at the same time, you know, so we'll have a look, see what I can find. That large building there is the back of the assembly rooms, which was like a sort of great sort of ballroom and what have you in the days of Georgian Bath. You know, they filmed bits of things like Bridgerton, that ahistorical nonsense there. And I've done many a literary festival event in there over the years, I have to say. Angela Carter liked Bath, but there were aspects of it she didn't like as well. She liked the kind of hippie aspects of it. Harvest, the awful shop, been around for more than 50 years. My friend Nick works there. Hey Nick. And you know, she liked a lot of the sort of socialist and alternative activity in the area. It was quite a hotbed then. But she found some of it pretentious, and there is an essay, the title of which I can't remember, which is in her collection Nothing Sacred, which is probably out of print now. There is like a collected essays, it's probably in there, and she writes about her blue plaque. And I can't think which person the blue plaque is dedicated to, but she sort of says really it translates into "here lived a sycophantic ass licker." Absolutely charming. But that was typical of her irreverence, really. Even early in the morning, you know, you've got to come up really early to get it really quiet in Bath. You'd have to be out here about 5 or something. It's always noisy. Little red door there, that's the Museum of East Asian Art. My friend Deb runs the gift shop there. Yeah, so as I say, many literary festival events here over the years, not doing them at the moment. And the most memorable one for me was one where I didn't get to meet the author. And that was a few years ago when Brett Anderson's first book came out in paperback. Brett Anderson from Suede. And I've seen Suede many times live, and I always thought that Brett was quite short, but he's actually really tall. He's about 6'3" or something, and he looked amazing. But I didn't get to talk to him because during the process of selling books there, because everything's remote, somebody who will remain nameless, 2 people in fact who I work with who remain nameless, I love them really, managed to pull out the cord to the PDQ, the machine that you sort of take card payments with their feet. And I wasn't too happy about this, as I had to sort of reboot everything and what have you, so I didn't get to talk to Brett, so I was really annoyed. But that's the sort of thing that happens in Litfest, it's literature live. Another thing that happened at one of the Litfest events, this must be 5-6 years ago, it was an event for, is it Rennie Edo Lodge, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, very sort of a best-selling book. It actually had a second wave of bestsellerdom during the lockdown, and it was one of the sort of first, you know, white people really need to get with the programme, re-racism and what have you. It's a very divisive book. I've read it, and it's factual and accurate in parts, I think, and I don't really think that sort of thing helps a lot of the time, if I'm quite honest, but that's just my personal opinion. But it's a real bestseller, and obviously, you know, it awakened sort of race consciousness in lots of people, which can't be a bad thing. But you know, as I say, I'm not entirely a fan of some of her approaches and what have you. But anyway, we were doing an event there, and I didn't get to see it because I was outside the main hall, and you could hear people starting to kick off and shout inside, "You're a racist," what have you. And you know, it was like wild. It was getting more like a rock and roll concert turning into a riot, you know, not quite, but you know, in as much as one will with these sort of things, really. I'm going to run some errands now and then get back home before the crowds come out, and you know, I'll talk to you a little bit more about Angela Carter. This is Milsom Street in Bath, and I have a long association going back to the mid-80s with this street. The first bookshop I worked in here when I first moved to Bath was where Paper Chase is now, that turquoise fronted building. And all in all, I've worked in 4 bookshops that were once on this street. Yeah, that's Paper Chase, and as I say, I moved to Bath in the spring of 1985, just for my 22nd birthday. And that was Bows and Bows bookshop then, which was a chain owned by Smiths, and we had a lovely sort of awning that we would pull down the front with a bill hook, but it was quite a dull conservative shop to work in. I didn't really like it very much, and I was assistant manager there for nearly a year. Yeah, and this shop here at number 17 Milsom Street, that I worked in there as well for about a year, maybe a bit longer, and that was Waterstones, and that was when I worked for them. And I can honestly say I had the best times of my career probably working in there. It was absolutely fantastic. There was so much great stuff going on. This is where I want to go, but it's too early. I've got to wait 20 minutes yet, so maybe it's time for a coffee. In the late 80s, this used to be a bookshop called Bilbo's, and I worked there for a year. It was great fun. So here I am, and in the hideout, and I have my Angela Carter Magic Toy Shop mug, which is probably in the glare here. The trouble with this house is it's so light, and it comes in a dinky little matching box. There you go, Paragon Classics. Again, the glare is probably ruining this. And there is, of course, an edition which looks exactly the same. So there you go. So we're cartering out today. I was a big fan of her work. I discovered her in the early 80s, and she sort of boomed in the 80s. She was a bit of a cult figure before that. Lots of acclaim, but not a huge amount of sales. And I think I discovered her shortly before the film The Company of Wolves came out. Now I've got a huge stack of Carterania on the desk in front of me, so bear with me while I manipulate it. And this is The Company of Wolves on Blu-ray, directed by Neil Jordan, who I'm generally not a massive fan of, and she co-wrote this with Jordan. It was based on 2 of her short stories from the collection known as The Bloody Chamber, and I saw this in the cinema in Caerphilly 84, very shortly before I moved to Bath. So so maybe it was 85. I was working in bookshop in Cardiff at the time, so that was her sort of mass exposure. And this book here, Knights of the Circus, that was her sort of breakthrough novel, published by Chato. That's the first edition, and that was a big thing for her in sort of 84. And I think it won the Whitbread Prize for Best Novel of the Year, or if it's shortlisted. I think maybe Kruger's Arp won the overall prize. And I don't think it was Booker shortlisted, and she never quite sort of had the sort of acclaim and what she should have had, really. She was a feminist, but not a feminist in the sort of like I hate men way. She had a very visceral mind. She was interested in French theory and what have you, and as I say, a visceral mind. So she rather reminds me of David Cronenberg. And that's what attracted me to her as a writer, was that a lot of female writers, to me, from a male perspective, seem to sort of be out of touch with the stickiness and the sensuality and the viscera. You know, there was their feelings and their brain, and the body was something separate. With Carter, you always felt that she didn't see any difference between the body and the mind. The two were intimately linked, and that's what I like in David Cronenberg as well. So she very much had a visceral mind, and that really appealed to me. And she had a very florid, expansive, verbose way of writing, very stylistic, and sort of great use of vocabulary, sometimes too much so. And she was a kind of postmodern fabulist. Her work had a fable-like element, and she was allied to science fiction and fantasy. She was a big fan of New Worlds magazine. She, strictly speaking, maybe never wrote any SF, though I would argue she did. This novel, Heroes and Villains, this is my original King Penguin edition from the 80s, very beautiful as you can see, and I put this in 100 must-read science fiction novels, and later in the video there'll be a reading from 100 must-read science fiction novels. So we're squeezing it all into this. We're doing a walkabout, we're doing Angela Carter in review, and we're doing 100 must-read science fiction novels as well, and really great stuff this. And this reminds me of the part of Brave New World where the protagonist goes out into the wilderness where the savages are, because in this there's a city which is full of scientists and their children, and outside is the sort of wild world and everybody's a barbarian. But we'll come back to that. So just to talk a bit more about her, she was living in Bristol in the late 60s, early 70s in Clifton, and she wrote a trilogy. They're a loose trilogy, it's not really a trilogy of books. Her first novel was called Shadow Dance, and she never mentions Bristol, but if you know that part of Bristol and the way she describes the buildings, you can tell it's either Bristol and Bath, and it's definitively Bristol because she lived in Clifton at that time. And I wasn't a massive fan of it, and then she did a book called The Magic Toy Shop. And The Magic Toy Shop is her first sort of major novel, I think, and this is a sort of great story. And there is a film of this which was made by ITV, and it is worth seeing. And it's a really interesting narrative of a young girl who ends up living with some not too close relatives, and it's about her sexual awakening and what have you, and it's very sort of vivid and fantastic. And she was very sort of big on the kind of symbolism which is now very commonplace in what I call floral gothic, strange toys, toy shops, attics stuffed with old dolls, that sort of thing. And she was really sort of a pioneer of that, but she could write really well, unlike a lot of her sort of followers, people who came after her. She was a real one-off. And This, I would say, is her sort of best early novel. Then she did a book called Several Perceptions, which is also known as Honey Buzzard in the USA, and that was the second of the Bristol Trilogy, and that won the Somerset Maugham Award. Now, the Somerset Maugham Award is an award for people, for writers, that you've got to spend it on travel to broaden your mind, and she went off to Japan, and she spent quite a long time in Japan. She had a relationship with a Japanese guy over there, and she's lived with him for quite some time. And she went back over again, and while she was in Japan, you know, it fired her imagination. She did lots of other writing, and something that came out of that, there's a few stories in one of her later books. This is much later on. This is a book called Fireworks, and this is the quartet first edition, and I seem to recall, I've not read this for years, that there's some stories in here, a souvenir of Japan, which were inspired by her time in Japan. She did this in the mid-70s, this collection, and there she is. And very striking looking, an interesting woman. So the early works were out of print, you know, until, you know, throughout her fame in the 80s, when she sort of rose to prominence and was regarded as a major British writer, they stayed out of print. It's just bizarre. Maybe she suppressed them, I don't know. And then she died, and it took some years after that for Several Perceptions, Shadow Dance and Love, the third in the Bristol Trilogy, to be reissued. And Shadow Dance and Several Perceptions particularly were very, very uncommon, and they cost you at least 120 quid. When I first won an ABE about 2002, I wouldn't look at ABE for years as I knew it would bankrupt me. I found her books on there, and they got reissued in dreadful trade paperbacks by Paragon. They were horrible covers, and they went out to print. I don't have them anymore because they're not major books, but I am going to reread them because they're able again now. They don't have nice covers or anything, but I'm going to give them another go. So her early books, there's the Bristol Trilogy, there's Magic Toy Shop, and before Love, which is the final of the Bristol Trilogy, and this is the first edition, and in Hart Davis, lovely little imprint. I do like Hart Davis, and it's got the sort of Dunia Rousseau type cover, as you see. This is quite uncommon. This is worth about 60 quid now, I would say, maybe a bit more, and I've seen it go for a lot more, and this is one I've had for ages. When it was reissued in hardcover and revised. I've not read this edition. I've read the revised one, so I'm looking forward to having a go at that at some point. It's sat on my shelf for years, awaiting a Carter revival. So that one was a good one, but before that came Heroes and Villains. So I'm getting the order all mixed up, aren't I? So let's go through it again. So Shadow Dance, the first of the Bristol Trilogy, The Magic Toy Shop, the second book and her best early novel, Several Perceptions, aka Honey Buzzard, the second of the Bristol Trilogy. Then we have Heroes and Villains, her SF novel, and then we have Love, the third of the Bristol Trilogy, which, as I say, in the current edition is revised. So really, to me, she didn't hit her stride till the 70s. Her hitting her stride in the 70s pretty much coincided with her moving to Bath, which I think is really interesting. And I didn't know at the time I read those books that she'd lived in Bath, and I didn't realise that what I regard as her best books came out of that milieu, you know, which is really interesting. So, and what are those best books? Well, as I say, I mentioned that Fireworks was one which came out after Love, and it is good, but it doesn't have the hallmark of a mature work. And she was quite, I would say, actually quite undisciplined as a writer. What she did was very expansive and unusual and mercurial, but it didn't always come off. But then she managed to balance the sort of structure and the excess really beautifully while she lived in Bath and she was writing. And the books which came out of that, I think, are her best works. And just to show you, I think the first one that came out of that period was this one, The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman. And Dr. Hoffman, obviously, there's a reference, there's two F's. So there's a reference there to Albert Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD. And this is kind of very much, I think this is actually trippier than people realise. I've got a King Penguin here, and I'm going to read, which is my first copy. And I'm going to read you the plot off the back so you get an idea of what it's about. And this is the King Penguin from the early 80s. This was the first one I bought, and really beautiful, these, and they're uncommon now. And what it says is that this is the story of a war fought against the diabolic Dr. Hoffman, who wanted to demolish the structures of reason and liberate man from the chains of the reality principle forever. Dr. Hoffman chooses the human mind and the human heart for his battleground, and it was left to Desiderio to stop him. And Desiderio is the sort of male sort of protagonist, and he falls in love with Hoffman's daughter. And it's very, very like the sort of things that Borges, Calvino, and the magical realists, who are quite trendy at this point, were doing. And a lot of it is very unrealistic and hallucinatory. And of course, this references Albert Hoffman. It also references, of course, E.T.A. Hoffman, Tales of Hoffman, the guy who wrote the Nutcracker and all those wonderful German romantic folk tales. So it's a dual reference. It's referencing the fantastic work of E.T.A. Hoffman and, you know, the psychoactive chemistry of Albert Hoffman, which was very prevalent in the 60s and 70s, obviously. Inside here, there's a postcard which Angela wrote to the original owner of this book. And I think the original owner was David Pringle. And she sent this postcard to him. There you go. Very sort of medieval type character. And I'll show you the back of it. And again, we're getting glare here, so you probably can't see it. There you go. And I'll read what it says. Dear David, herewith 2 personalised copies of Dr. Hoffman. I'm sad to hear about the vicissitudes of the Science Fiction Foundation, but will indeed put my mind to Calvino when I get some time. Yours, Angela. So there you go. I mentioned Calvino, didn't I? And I think that David might be David Pringle. I don't know. I think I asked him once online, and he sort of half nodded to that. But obviously, he had to move his copies on. But there you go. So that's a good one. Great novel. Still in print. Do pick it up. So that was the sort of first flowering of the fiction. I think she moved from Bristol to Bath, and she was finishing that one off, I think, was the way it went. There's a great biography of her, which is by a man, and I'll flash up on the screen now. It looks like this. So she moved into the house in Hay Hill, and the builder working across the street, Mark, she was a younger guy than her, and she sort of fell for him, and they got together. And I think they got married, and they had a little boy who must have only been about, you know, he can't have been very old when Carter died. It was very, very sad. So, you know, it's a great shame. But she also wrote in that house. She also wrote the book I showed you earlier on, The Passion of New Eve, which is one of my favourite novels by her. And this is in Gollanc's Fantasy and Macabre. And some great sort of stuff went into this. One book that went into that, I'll show you now. I don't have the Gollanc's Fantasy and Macabre version of it, which I hope to remedy one day, and that was the first book by Salman Rushdie, a book called Grimace. And this is the original paperback edition of Grimace, which, as you can see, is a panther, and it's got that traditional look that you would get on Panther, Granada, Grafton, Mayflower, and it's kind of a sort of fantasy novel. It's got a endorsement by Ursula K. Le Guin, and this was the sort of Rushdie that nobody read. When he exploded in the early 80s and mid 80s, people would say, you know, when they were buying the Satanic Verses, oh, I've read his other 2 books, and I'd say, but there are 3, and they hadn't read Grimace because it was published by Paladin then, and I pop it out and sell it to them. And it's I've not read this for years and years and years. I remember it's quite incoherent, but rather like some of Angela's work was in the early days. But I'm going to give it a re-go at some point. At some point I'm going to try and pick up a first in the Gollanc's Fantasy and Macabre series. The Gollanc's Fantasy and Macabre series was created by Liz Calder, who worked at Gollanc's then, for their kind of uncategorizable books. They were really just fantasy books, but it wasn't fantasy in terms of sword and sorcery. I mean, one book that went into that was the first UK hardcover edition, The Book of Skulls by Robert Silverberg, which is a book I love because of its uncertain genre status, because Silverberg rather withholds information, so you can't really tell whether it's a mainstream novel, a fantasy novel, or a science fiction novel. I'm not going to tell you how or why, but you need to read it for yourself, and at the end try and decide what it is. If you would use what I've said in my videos about the key elements of SF, things like the novum, the paradigm shift, conceptual breakthrough, use those sort of things when you read the Book of Skulls, and you know, you'll still be baffled by, you know, what is actually going on there. And that's what's one of the great things about it. But yes, so Passion New Eve is my favourite from that period. That was published in 1977. And the first copy I bought and read was this Virago Modern Classics one, which is from the mid-80s. And that, on the cover, is a painting by Picabia, one of the surrealists, who I really like, and you never see much of his work. And Virago then was a relatively new publisher, and you know, a virago, of course, means like a harridan or a termagant, you know, a shrewish, difficult siren of a woman. And they published loads and loads and loads of really great women's writing. They published 2 books by men. They published an H.G. Wells, I think it was An Unsociable Socialist. Maybe it was Anne Veronica, I can't remember. And they published a book by George Bernard Shaw as well. So unlike Women's Press, they did do books by men. They were dead men, admittedly, and they were pro sort of women books. Though H.G. Wells, of course, was a great believer in free love. And as long as he got his leg over, I think he was quite keen on feminism. But there you go. So, yeah, so that's a really beautiful one. And the narrator is a man. And he's in New York, it's all neon, and it's written in a very sort of vivid, fantastical, futuristic style. It always reminds you of William Gibson in a way. And he is obsessed with this movie star, and he follows this woman who he intends to rape, I seem to recall. And basically, he goes through all these adventures, and he ends up in this rather sort of picaresque narrative where he is sort of mutilated and some operations are performed on him and he's turned into a woman, so he sees things from a woman's point of view. You know, he gets his sort of masculine cruelty pulled away from him, and he ends up with a poet called Zero, who's just kind of misogynistic character, and it's fantastic, and it's a real sort of takes him a real Hagira, a real journey, a real odyssey through, you know, sexual politics and stuff. But it's not sort of preachy. It's really good. And it's very savage and colourful. And as I say, the visceral mind. And I love that book. It's fantastic. So I've not read it again for a long time. So I'm going to go back to it. I keep picking up now and again and I read a little bit of it. And I always think this is such fabulous writing. So sort of just full of life, you know, magnificent stuff. So that's a great one. And Carter then at the very end of the 70s seemed to get discovered by the mainstream in a sort of big sense. Her kind of breakthrough book critically, if not commercially, was the short story collection. I think they came out in 79. I think this came out. This is The Bloody Chamber and Other Stories, which I mentioned earlier. And this is a reissue from the mid-80s. It's not a first. I actually prefer this cover to the first. And this, I say, was the first book I read by her. And oh, look inside, there's a little postcard in here. And that's a promotional postcard for the film, The Company of Wolves, which, as I say, was based on 2 stories in here. The story, The Company of Wolves, which you can read 2 ways. I mean, it's a company as in a gathering, and a company in it you like to be with wolves. And also there's a story in here called Wolf Alice. And another called The Werewolf, which I don't think comes up in any part of it. And it's a kind of portmanteau film. This young girl is sort of dreaming, and she's played by Sarah Patterson, who was a very toothsome and beautiful young lady who you never saw much of after that. And it riffs on the whole thing of Little Red Riding Hood, you know, werewolf stories and what have you. It's got some stunning special effects in it. And it's just great. And she sort of took this thing of the old fairy tales and she brought the sort of guts back into them. They've been sanitized for children, people like Grimm and what have you, and Hans Christian Andersen. They've been sort of sanitized, and she sort of brought the sort of Freudian and Jungian sort of underpinnings back up to the surface, the sex, the blood, the violence, you know, the dreaminess and stuff. And the thing about Carter is that one artist who she reminds me of, or reminds me of her because Carter was active before the person I'm going to cite, is Kate Bush. So Angela Carter is like, if you know Kate Bush's work, particularly the early stuff, which is full of fantastic imagery and it's very sort of expressionistic and wild, and it really grabs you by the scruff of the neck, and you've got to listen to it. And of course, Kate was trained by Lindsay Kemp, David Bowie's mime tutor, how to dance. She did those amazing videos of things like Babushka and what have you. And Angela Carter's rather like that. She's very carnivalesque. Maybe she's carnivalesque rather than postmodern. The imagery of the sideshow, vaudeville, circuses, what sort of things. So there's a kind of Bradbury element there as well. But she brought that all back out and was hugely influential. And for many years now, she's been the most studied British female contemporary author at universities, and there's loads of monographs about her, and she's a huge cult amongst young women. She's taught everywhere, and her influence, I think, hasn't always been, you know, a welcome one. There's been some really bad things influenced by her, but she, of course, was fantastic. This is a great starting place. So if you've never read her before, read this and you get a real sort of understanding. And she was groundbreaking that way. It wasn't that nobody else. Tanith Lee was doing similar things, but Tanith Lee was more sort of steeped in genre, whereas Angela was more, you know, in a broader sort of literary sense. You know, she was just as likely to quote Shakespeare as she was Edgar Allan Poe, shall we say. But it's great stuff. And then a few years later, she did this, to say Knights of the Circus. And Knights of the Circus is a very funny, picaresque novel about a 6'4" woman from the East End called Feathers. That's feathers with 2 V's in it, Feathers, who has wings and she can fly. She's an aerialist in the circus. And, you know, is she real or not? But yeah, you know, she actually does have wings. She's supposedly born out of an egg, so she's a bit like sort of an angel or a bird. And she's foul-mouthed and sweaty, and it's great stuff, and she's very sexy. And this journalist, you know, really falls for her. And again, there's a wonderful sort of quest sequence in this, which is set in Siberia when they're on a train, and the journalist falls off the train. He's in pursuit of her, and he gets picked up by some Lapps. And they make him drink reindeer urine. Of course, because the reindeer have been eating fly agaric mushrooms, the traditional toadstools, the red ones with the white spots. And of course, you know, you hallucinate if you do that and stuff. So it's really, really wild. But it's great. And that was a breakthrough book. And she made some proper money of that, which is good, because she hadn't made a lot before that. She sort of scrimped and saved a lot. And she was a real original talent. So that was a breakthrough book. There was a long period then between 84 and the end of her life, which I think was 1992, where she didn't produce much. She produced a collection of short stories called Black Venus, which looks like this. And she produced a novel about twins who were hoofers. They were in vaudeville, they were on the stage, so 20s, 30s and maybe earlier, called Wise Children, which I didn't like so much, and I bought it when it first came out. I sold it a few years ago. It's worth about 70-80 quid now. It used to be quite a common book. There must have been a big printing of it, and I wasn't so keen on that, and I didn't feel she was at her peak. And I think one of her last books, I think her last work of fiction was probably this, American Ghosts and Old World Wonders, which has got some good short stories in it, but again, I didn't feel was quite up to her sort of, you know, 70s sort of work. And there's stories in here about Lizzie Borden and what have you. And yeah, this is actually posthumous. So this is the stuff that was left over. So let's have a look. This actually came out in 93. She died the year before. So that was a posthumous collection. Great shame. And I'd love to have met her. And I had a feeling that with some of these stories, there were signs she was starting to recover the mojo she had in the 70s. So, and that she was going to start to produce some really savage and visceral work again. And it would have been fascinating to see how she responded to, you know, the rising tech of the 90s and the internet and stuff. It would have been really, really interesting. She wrote lots of journalism and cultural history. She's a really, really amazing woman, and plays, the radio. I had a book called Come Into These Yellow Sands, which I bought 2 copies of new at a remainder store in Hay-on-Wye. They cost me £5 a piece, and I sold them for £40 each. I kept one for years, and I got rid of it at Cull. I should have really kept it. It was published by Blood Axe. Very uncommon book in hardcover, and not that common in paperback. So if you ever see it, pick it up. You can get all her work now in sort of collections. There's a collected prose, which I think is called Burning Your Boats, and there's a collected dramatic works as well. And I did have those, but they were rather ugly hardcovers, and you can pick them up in even uglier vintage paperbacks if you want. So, you know, so they're there. So I am going to be reappraising her soon, because I've not read any for a long time. And anyway, here's a little reading from 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels about heroes and villains. There will be a shorter version of this clip uploaded separately for people who don't want to sit through the entire Carter overview and who just want to focus on the SF. Primarily, the books of science fiction interest in Carter's oeuvre are as follows: from 1969, Heroes and Villains; from the mid-70s, The Infernal Design Machines of Dr. Hoffman; and then 1977, The Passion of New Eve. And as I say, these are all books which have connections to Bath, except Heroes and Villains, which was written in Bristol. This is what I said about Heroes and Villains in 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels. Angela Carter, 1940-1992, UK. Heroes and Villains, 1969. And here what you're seeing is the US first edition, Simon & Schuster. The UK edition's Hart Davis, and it's a lot more uncommon and hard to find in good condition. And as I say, this is the King Penguin B format, which I first bought in the 80s. Onwards. Angela Carter's death from cancer in 1992 robbed modern English literature of one of its most original and inventive talents. All her books contain elements of fantasy and speculation, but few of them can be convincingly claimed for science fiction. Heroes and Villains is one of these. It is set in a future world that has been devastated by nuclear disaster. Although Carter places little emphasis on this, and her main interest is in the characters who populate the world rather than the events which brought it into being. Her central protagonist, Marianne, lives in what is almost literally an ivory tower, an isolated bastion of literacy and technological know-how in a wild forest filled with barbarians, tattooed men and women who have reverted to tribal primitivism. Marianne's father is one of the Professors, the group that preserves the pre-Holocaust heritage, but after his death, she escapes into the forest and joins forces with Jewel, a barbarian leader whose vitality and virility both fascinates and appalls her. In Jewel's company, she experiences the often brutal reality of life outside the confines of that ivory tower. Heroes and Villains is a remarkable book, which even after several readings, remains open to endless interpretation and reinterpretation. On the one hand, it is a baroque tale of the future, filled with fantasy and magic, in which the heroine is led from a sheltered world to a richer but more dangerous one. On the other, it is a fable of civilization meeting barbarism, in which the sterile rationality of the professors in their towers is seen as inadequate and constraining. Men, and more significantly, women, need to confront the irrational and the primitive within them and to learn the value of imagination and mystery in their lives if they are to become their true selves. So that's Heroes and Villains, and to sort of read on, I recommend it that people also read the Infernal Design Machines of Dr. Hoffman, and to look at The Bloody Chamber as well, which is the short story collection from the late 70s, which spawned The Company of Wolves, as I've said elsewhere, and that's probably her most influential and popular book still. And I recommended some other sort of fabula books as well, including Paul Auster's In the Country of Last Things, which I'm actually not very fond of. I don't think Auster can write science fiction. He can write pretty much anything, but his two attempts at SF are not very good at all. John Crowley's Little Big and Craig Key Streets If All Else Fails were similar things which I recommended. So, but Carter really was sui genre. She was one of a kind, but she's hugely influential. So that's Heroes and Villains. That's the one to pick up if you're interested in SF, though the others I've mentioned here and show here do have SF elements. I would say that if you can get early 70s editions of Heroes and Villains, they're in A format. I think there was an Arrow one and maybe a Quartet one, and they were published and packaged as science fiction. And Heroes and Villains, despite what I said there in that text about fantasy and magic, I think that actually might have been written by my co-author Nick Renison rather than me, because it doesn't feel like my style, even though there's certainly some of my insights in there, I would say. So possibly he wrote at least part of that. But you know, there is not fantasy or magic in it. It just has a fantastic feel. It's very definitively SF. So if you can see that in a format edition, snap it up, because they are uncommon now. Great book. Probably my favourite single novel by her, I guess, after The Passion of New Eve. So there's a little potted chat about Angela Carter. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it inspires you to sort of pick up her work. Not a very literary or structured talk, I know, but purely one born of enthusiasm for her wonderful work, and great sadness that she's no longer around, and I think she would have done even more great stuff. So if you want to read a great postmodern fabulist, a feminist who was not into misandry, she didn't hate men, and she had lots of really interesting insights, Angela Carter is very much a person to go for. So this is Outlaw Bookseller. Please subscribe, like and watch the backlist on the channel, and I'll sign out for now and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.